Lecture 4. Defining Modernism, Beyond Impressionism.
In an essay published in 1924 titled Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, Virginia Woolf wrote the following sentence. It's become one of the most famous sentences in the critical history of modernism. On or about December 1910, human character changed. What did she mean? And why this specific date? Let's leave the big question, the big first question, implicit for the moment, and answer the second. Why December 1910? The quick answer, the most fundamental answer, is that from November 8th, 1910 through January 15th, 1911, there ran in London an exhibition of post-impressionist paintings. It was reviled at its opening by an immense range of respectable artists and intellectuals, as well as the general public, which was disgusted by many of the images that were shown there. But the show triumphed over its mocking reception, opening England to the tides of modernism and securing its place, the show's place, in the history of the modernist movement. One example of the intense hostility that these then experimental paintings generated can be shown from this quote, from this passage in a diary written by a literary and artistic intellectual of the time, Wilfrid Blunt. He spoke in his diary entry of that gross puerility which scrawls indecencies on the wall of a privy, and compared that to the paintings. He said, "These are not works of art at all. They are the works of idleness, impotent stupidity, a pornographic show." It seems amazing to us today, from this vantage point in the 21st century, that an art which seems in some way so stylized and certainly tame in comparison to the pornography we can click on the internet, or even bump into by going to the local newsstand, it seems astonishing today that these materials would have aroused such hostility, and especially such offense at the representation of human bodies. But as I'll try to indicate a bit later, the representation of sexuality and the representation of our lives in our physical bodies is one of the central projects of modernism, and is one of the central reasons to value modernist literature especially. It's often forgotten that modern literature and art was deeply committed to examining our lives in our bodies with a vigorous, unsentimental candor that previous art did not manage. You might think, in trying to imagine what this post-impressionist exhibition in London was like, you might think of some of the famous paintings of bathers, naked bathers, although they're very stylized paintings if you've seen them, by various post-impressionists, especially Picasso and Cézanne, both of whom did very famous paintings of bathers, of women bathing. The show I'm describing, the post-impressionist exhibition, was organized by Virginia Woolf's friend, the art critic Roger Fry. And the show itself is actually described in some detail in a biography that Woolf herself wrote about Fry, published in 1940. The show was titled Manet and the Post-Impressionists, and it included paintings by Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, and some of the younger post-impressionists as well, including Matisse and Picasso. Different as these and other post-impressionist painters are, they share certain features, and in particular one great defining principle, which will have a decisive counterpart in the literary texts we'll be studying in these lectures. This is the principle that exaggeration or distortion may lead one to a deeper or more compelling truth than the exact representation of physical or outward reality. Now, of course, we've already seen how this is a principle deeply embedded in the first generation of French Impressionist paintings, and I was trying to indicate something of that when I spoke about the way in which the trajectory of Monet's career leads toward a greater and greater degree of abstraction in which the realistic representation remains present in the painting, but declines in importance and it competes with the painting's interest in form and color and volume. But perhaps one could say that this distorting element grows more obtrusive and more central in the post-impressionists. One sort of motto or distillation of this principle comes from Matisse, inspired by Cézanne, who said, "Exactitude is not truth." An apparently paradoxical statement, but one we will see, the truth of which we will see reflected again and again in some of the literary texts we'll be looking at. One strand or path for this principle of exactitude being sacrificed to truth leads to the painterly movement called surrealism. And there are a number of possible choices one might make to embody these principles. But maybe a touchstone or a representative piece, in part because it reflects not only the surrealist movement, but even more the influence of a movement that came to be called Cubism, and even the related movement that was linked to Cubism and grew out of it in some degree called Futurism. The touchstone for our purposes to illustrate this principle might be the famous painting by Duchamp called Nude Descending a Staircase, painted or exhibited in 1912. Almost every 20th and 21st century human being has an optical memory, I think, of this famous and in many ways strange painting. What's of special note in the painting are a couple of things, I think. The recognizable nude descending the staircase virtually disappears. And it seems as if what Duchamp is trying to represent are the successive movements of a single body. It's likely that he was influenced by the multiple exposure photography documented by Edward Muybridge in the precursor of the movies in the famous book, The Horse in Motion. And it's likely that the painting was influenced by that book in certain ways, and by Muybridge's example. We note, if we look at the painting, an emphasis on the geometric, the machined, and the metallic. It's important to remember that the modern period is the era of machines and of transforming new technologies and mechanizing forces, and that's partly reflected in the nude descending a staircase. Maybe most important, however, is this attempt to represent simultaneity. The collapsing or manipulation of time in the painting. The nude is in motion not only in space but also in time. The artist is attempting to represent or gesture toward the representation of motion and duration simultaneously. The painting wants to show us something of the simultaneity that aims for a kind of simultaneity. And this is linked, of course, to its profound tendency to abstraction. This will be these impulses, especially the impulse to manipulate time, and this abstracting impulse will be a signal feature of many of our literary texts as well. We might also, to illustrate this principle, look at a range of Picasso paintings. Almost any of Picasso's middle and late paintings would fit the bill here. The Dora Maar portraits are a particularly good example in which we see Picasso famously representing his mistress in ways that turn her partly into a kind of geometric figure, in which her face is squared off, in which her various body parts, insofar as they're represented at all, are represented in forms that systematically distort and have a kind of mechanizing or abstracting or geometric element or dimension. Another way to think about this distorting element is to think about the satiric or disgusted images of depravity and nightmare that we find in German Expressionism, a painterly movement connected to another aspect of painterly modernism, but influenced especially by certain tendencies within German culture itself. Franz Kafka, the great writer we'll be looking at later in these lectures, is a part of and very influential figure in this movement of Expressionism. For our purposes now, though, we might look at a fairly famous painting by the Expressionist painter Max Beckmann. There are a number of paintings that he did that would fit the bill, but there's one especially called Family Picture that I want to talk about briefly. It now exists in the New York Museum. I want to describe this last unforgettable expression of thoughtful contempt and disgust at the human family. The painting shows a strange grouping of human beings in a room. The perspective is altered in the painting as if in a dream. The characters are distorted and unrealistically represented in some ways, although they're perfectly recognizable as figures. The space is cramped and confined, a single room in which the ceiling and the floor seem to be pressing the characters together. And there's a horizontal pressure against them as well. They're sort of crammed together across the horizontal length of the picture. There's a child sprawled like a small octopus in the lower foreground. The heads of all the figures are much larger than the bodies. There's a standing woman in a red slip, her cone of red hair literally hitting against the ceiling. Or maybe you have the feeling the ceiling is pressing down on her hair. And she's admiring herself in a mirror. Seated beside her is a woman I'll call Grandma, an older woman. Grandma covers her face in woe like the character in Munch's Scream. There's a dwarfish gross man with a pipe and leprechaun-type shoes reclining next to the standing woman, to the left of the standing woman. They look like ugly characters from a nastier and meaner Maurice Sendak. None of the figures, crushed together as they are, looks at one another or seems aware of anyone. Garish colors, mushroom-shaped lights coming out of the ceiling further distort the atmosphere. Beckmann is illustrating the metamorphosis or being inspired by the metamorphosis. And it's not an accident that the editor and translator Stanley Korngold chose to reproduce this picture on the cover of his edition of the Metamorphosis. But I'd like to end on a less disgusted note in talking about these paintings, with an earlier and centrally post-impressionist painting, which I think speaks more directly and more fully, more completely, maybe more generously to the idea of modernism that our course is interested in. It's an immensely greater painting as well. It's Van Gogh's Starry Night, painted in 1889. Remember this wonderful painting? A rural village is seen from a hilltop or a high vantage point. On the left of the painting, a fiery evergreen, a cypress, thrusts flame-like up into the sky. Down lower in the valley, in the very center of the canvas, there's a church steeple. But the church steeple is dwarfed in a way by the fiery energy, flaming, thrusting energy of the tree that I've on the left, and also by the swirling, roiling electric strokes of blue and white that seem to show the sky in a vibrating motion. And the vibrating motion of the sky is at the very center of one's experience of the picture. No conventional stars are to be seen, but balls of swirling yellow and white and orange. Almost as if miniature supernovas in the middle of the painting. And when you're in the presence of the painting, no reproduction does it full justice. When you're actually in the presence of the painting, you become aware of the thickness of the paint. You want to reach out and touch it. And if there weren't guards there to keep you from doing so, many people would probably do so, because the thickness of the paint is so much an aspect of your experience of the painting. It makes you aware of the painting, as an object made of oil paints and canvas. And it also suggests a kind of immense self-reflexiveness or self-awareness on the part of the painter. It's a picture, in a way, about the making of a picture. There's an emotional dimension to it. You feel that the painter felt a kind of desperation to capture something that's disappearing in the very instant that he's seeing it, in the very instant of its occurring, as if he's trying to capture the uniqueness and fluidity of this single moment. And so you feel the evanescence of the moment, but also its incredible beauty. Part of the reason is that you feel that Van Gogh is in a kind of desperate frenzy himself to capture it before it disappears. We know, in fact, that he put some of the paint on the painting with his finger, with his thumb, and you can see thumbprints on the painting as well. So that's another way in which the subjectivity, the personality of the artist is a part of your experience of the painting. The emotional dimension of the painting, the feeling you get when you look at the painting, that's something of Van Gogh's own desperation and own desire to represent the world, and also his fear that he can't do it, that the world is escaping him, even as he's creating the painting, is a profound aspect of one's experience of looking at this remarkable work of art. The agony and the ecstasy of this astonishing painting will be replicated, though in verbal registers, in Conrad, in Ford Madox Ford, in Joyce, and maybe most compellingly in D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. But to conclude this introduction to post-impressionism, and as a context for our literary study, I'd like to return to literature proper, and to begin to give an answer to the first and much more complex question: what did Virginia Woolf mean when she said that human character had changed? I think part of the answer, but only part of it, the full answer will emerge, I think, through the whole course of these lectures. Part of the answer can be found in a simple exercise or teaching strategy that I learned from Richard Ellman and from his modern fiction course many years ago, and have been deploying with my own variations ever since. It's another way to distill elements of the modern as part of a context for our reading of particular texts. In my classes on modern literature, modern fiction, I usually distribute a series of first paragraphs to 19th and 20th century books without identifying them, to whet the students' appetite for reading and for the adventure of our course. And I want to try a more modest version of that here, so I'll read first without identifying the paragraphs, but I won't leave you in suspense very long. As soon as I complete the paragraph, I will tell you who wrote it. And what I'd like to do is to compare, again, the earlier with the later paragraphs, and they're all beginnings. They're all the very beginnings of novels. And I think doing so will help to clarify some of the profound differences between these two traditions of literature, and will help us to understand what is unique and distinctive about the modern. Beginning number 1. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. Well, of course, that's Jane Austen, Emma, 1815. One of the things to note about the paragraph, of course, is how confident Austen is about the shared vocabulary of moral understanding she has with her audience. And also, of course, the expository clarity of this beginning. The reader is situated instantly. Some fundamental things about Emma's nature are generalized in a confident, omniscient way by Austen's voice. Emma's clever, she's rich, she's lived comfortably, she has a happy disposition, she unites the best blessings of existence. Well, Austen has confidence that a phrase like best blessings of existence will signify for her audience. Right? Now, let's compare that with the 20th century beginning. He was an inch, perhaps 2 under 6 feet, powerfully built, and he advanced straight at you with a slight stoop of the shoulders, head forward, and a fixed from under stare which made you think of a charging bull. His voice was deep, loud, and his manner displayed a kind of dogged self-assertion which had nothing aggressive in it. It seemed a necessity, and it was directed apparently as much at himself as at anybody else. He was spotlessly neat, apparelled in immaculate white from shoes to hat, and in the various eastern ports where he got his living, as a ship chandler's water clerk, he was very popular. Well, maybe the ship chandler gives away the paragraph. It's a paragraph by Conrad. It's the beginning to his great novel, Lord Jim, published in 1900. What a contrast with Austen. Think about it for a moment. Conrad's narrator doesn't even have the confidence to tell us how tall this man is. He's an inch or perhaps 2 under 6 feet. Well, tell it, which is it? There's a tentativeness, an uncertainty, a qualified fearfulness almost about the narrator's willingness to generalize. Listen again. He had a fixed from under stare which made you think of a charging bull. And he says his manner displayed a kind of self-assertion which seemed a necessity. Well, doesn't the narrator know? And of course the answer is he doesn't. It was directed apparently as much at himself. The sense of uncertainty, the sense of tentativeness is profound there. But there's something else. How little real exposition is there? When we finish that Conrad paragraph, we know something about Jim. A good deal, in fact, and many of those details will become much more resonant as the book goes on. But we certainly are not situated clearly in a morally coherent universe whose basic parameters have already been established by a confident, all-knowing author. Let's try another example. 19th century beginning. While the present century was in its teens, and on one sunshiny morning in June, there drove up to the great iron gate of Miss Pinkerton's Academy for Young Ladies on Chiswick Mall a large family coach with 2 fat horses in blazing harness, driven by a fat coachman in a 3-cornered hat and wig, at the rate of 4 miles an hour. A black servant who reposed on the box beside the fat coachman uncurled his bandy legs as soon as the equipage drew up opposite Miss Pinkerton's shining brass plate. And as he pulled the bell, at least a score of young heads were seen peering out of the narrow windows of the stately old brick house. Nay, the acute observer, 19th century fiction is full of acute observers, nay, the acute observer might have recognized the little red nose of good-natured Miss Jemima Pinkerton herself, rising over some geranium pots in the window of that lady's drawing room, own drawing room. That's Thackeray from his great novel Vanity Fair, published 1847, 1848. What an astounding and remarkable and very beautiful paragraph. I don't mean this comparison to suggest that 19th century fiction does not give us immense pleasures. It does. It's a very great, very rich fiction. I'm just trying to describe fundamental differences between the two traditions. In this paragraph, think for a moment of how much this narrator claims to know. And how detailed his knowledge is. The present century is in its teens. The large family coach has 2 fat, not just horses, they're fat horses. There's a fat coachman. He knows that he wears, what his clothing is like. He even knows how fast the coach is going, 4 miles an hour. There's a precision here that suggests a kind of knowledgeability that has no end, as if the omniscient powers of the narrator are so great that there's no detail unavailable to his hovering intelligence, to his omniscient understanding. And when we get to the passage that talks about the number of at least a score of young heads looks out. This omniscient perspective also has the power to see from many different angles at once. It can focus down closely if it wishes to, or it can pull back in a kind of panoramic view and give us a whole panorama. The immense power, the immense confidence of this narrating intelligence is one of the delights of the paragraph, and one source both of its verbal energy and of its comedy. Well, compare this sentence, beginning, this first paragraph. Through the fence, between the curling flower spaces, I could see them hitting. They were coming toward where the flag was, and I went along the fence. Luster was hunting in the grass by the flower tree. They took the flag out, and they were hitting. Then they put the flag back, and they went to the table. And he hit, and the other hit. Then they went on, and I went along the fence. Luster came away from the flower tree, and we went along the fence. And they stopped, and we stopped, and I looked through the fence, while Luster was hunting in the grass. Now, my goodness, what is going on here? If you've never read this book, you have no idea. You're lost. You're completely baffled. Who's speaking here? What is he describing? And of course, that is the beginning of Faulkner's great novel, The Sound and the Fury. It's the voice of the idiot Benji, who is the narrator of the first section of the novel. And you have to read through that entire first section before you even begin to get some minimal sense of what Benji is talking about. Benji doesn't have a language or a vocabulary or an understanding to recognize that, of course, what he's describing is a game of golf. And we come to realize that later in the novel, he's running along the fence because, as we learn again much later in the novel, his favorite playground, his favorite play area was this wonderful pasture, which his father sold in order to get money to send one of his sons, Quentin Compson, to Harvard. So he sold the pasture off, and poor Benji no longer is allowed to go into the pasture. So he runs along the side of the pasture and looks over the fence at the golfers. The pasture has now become a golf course. Luster is the black servant who takes care of Benji. And when Luster is hunting in the grass, he's hunting for golf balls. Now, none of these facts become available to us until we're much deeper into the novel, 50 or 75 or 100 pages in, before all of these details are clear to us. Faulkner is obviously up to a very different game. He plunges us in the middle of things, into a consciousness whose nature we need to decipher, whose nature we need to understand. And he doesn't speak at all with the all-knowing, confident knowledgeability of a 19th century omniscient narrator. Modernist writers, modernist narrators, not just first-person narrators, but even modernist narrators who claim something of the third-person powers of the old omniscient narrators of the 18th and 19th century have radically reduced powers. Why? Part of the reason is that they live in this skeptical, pessimistic, problematic, disorderly environment I described in our previous lectures. They are the heirs to uncertainty. They are the heirs to instability. They are the heirs to a notion of the fluidity and immense complexity of a world that no longer has the kind of stabilizing coherences that earlier religious and moral and institutional dispensations created for people. And so that the beginnings of modern novels and the beginnings of modern novels therefore reflect this much more problematic, this much more fluid, this much more uncertain environment. One more example. With a single drop of ink for a mirror, the Egyptian sorcerer undertakes to reveal to any chance comer far-reaching visions of the past. This is what I undertake to do for you, reader. With this single drop of ink at the end of my pen, I will show you the roomy workshop of Mr. Jonathan Burge, carpenter and builder, in the village of Hayslope, as it appeared on the 18th of June in the year of our Lord, 1799. George Eliot, Adam Bede, one of the great writers of all time. Many things to note here, but the confidence of the author. She can even call attention to her writerly process without threatening or without feeling that she's threatening the plausibility or believability of her world. With this single drop of ink, reader, I will recreate the world. Listen to this contrasting passage. To begin with, I wish to disclaim the possession of those high gifts of imagination and expression which would have enabled my pen to create for the reader the personality of the man who called himself, after the Russian custom, Cyril, son of Isidore, Razumov. And of course, that is the beginning of Conrad's great political novel, Under Western Eyes. Compare the confident self-consciousness of George Eliot to the nervous, apologetic, I can't write, confessional quality of Conrad's first-person narrator. Henry James, one of the great theorists of modern fiction, spoke of modern fiction as being committed to what he called the muted majesty of authorship. The majesty of authorship in modern fiction is muted because the modern writers are much more conscious than their predecessors of the limitations of language, the limitations of our conceptual categories, the limitations of words and of artistic traditions themselves. In the problematic and uncertain universe of modern fiction, there are other compensations and other virtues, but the certainty and the self-confidence of the older tradition is gone.